The pry bar slipped through the pine decking like a warm knife through block lard, even though the surface acrylic coat still looked factory fresh. Beneath that glossy, $60 marine-grade shell, the cell walls of the wood had completely collapsed into a damp, sour-smelling gray sludge. 3 feet away, a rough-sawn white oak fence post set by an Amish farmer in 1924 sat in the exact same clay soil, bone-dry and structurally sound, without a single coat of store-bought paint. How does a simple, unpainted piece of timber survive a century of freezing rains and humid summers, while high-tech synthetic sealers rot pressure-treated pine from the inside out in under 48 months? To understand why your deck is rotting underneath its shiny finish, you have to look at what happens to wood cells under a microscope when the sun hits them. Standard pressure-treated lumber contains bound water trapped within the cell cavities of the cellulose fibers. When you brush on a modern acrylic or polyurethane sealer, you are spreading a thin sheet of plastic over those pores. For 12 to 18 months, it looks fantastic. Water beads up on the surface, sliding off in neat little droplets just like the commercial promised. But acrylic resins are rigid polymers. As temperatures fluctuate between 40 degrees at night and 90 degrees under direct afternoon sunlight, the wood expands and contracts at 3 times the rate of the plastic shell glued to its surface. Microscopic hairline cracks form along the grain lines, cracks too small for your eye to catch, but wide enough for liquid water to enter through capillary action. Once water creeps underneath that rubbery film, the synthetic coating turns into a miniature solar pressure cooker. Sun beating down on the deck heats the trapped water, converting it into moisture vapor that cannot escape through the impermeable plastic barrier above. The internal vapor pressure spikes, breaking down the lignin, the organic glue holding wood fibers together, and creating an ideal, high-humidity anaerobic environment for wet rot fungus to feast on the structural sugars inside the board. You end up with a deck that looks fully protected on top, while the load-bearing heartwood underneath turns into a gray sponge that crumbles under your boots. The lumber industry pushes these synthetic sealers because they fail on a predictable cycle, forcing homeowners to strip, sand, and reapply every 2 to 3 seasons until the wood's structural failure requires complete replacement. But the old timber builders understood a fundamental law of fluid mechanics that modern paint manufacturers deliberately ignore. Modern deck stains and exterior latex acrylics are engineered to form a continuous, rubbery barrier across timber grain. On paper, it sounds logical. You coat a pine board in liquid plastic, it cures into a waterproof glove, and rain slides right off the surface. But wood is not a static block of synthetic material. It is a dense bundle of microscopic hollow tubes designed by nature to draw and release moisture, expanding and contracting with every shift in atmospheric humidity. When summer heat bakes an acrylic-sealed deck board up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the timber underneath expands. The synthetic film stretches to accommodate that movement. But after 18 to 24 months of direct ultraviolet radiation, that plastic skin loses its elasticity and microfractures open, hairline cracks measuring less than 50 microns across. During the next heavy rain, liquid water gets sucked deep into those tiny fissures through capillary action. Here is where the moisture trap snaps shut. Liquid water enters effortlessly through those cracks, but it cannot escape. The acrylic coating covering the rest of the board has a vapor perm rating near 0, meaning moisture cannot evaporate back out through the synthetic film. Trapped beneath the surface, liquid water evaporates during heat cycles, hits the underside of that plastic skin, condenses, and drenches the inner grain over and over again in a closed loop. You would expect a coated board to outlast bare wood sitting in the rain, but field testing from the USDA Forest Products Laboratory revealed a brutal contradiction. Timber sealed with modern film-forming acrylics rots up to 3 times faster than completely untreated raw pine left exposed to the weather. Bare wood gets wet, but it also dries out. Film-sealed wood creates a dark, humid greenhouse inside the grain, pushing internal moisture content well past the critical 20% threshold where decay organisms trigger. Spores of Coneophora pudiana, the classic wet rot fungus, sit dormant in almost all domestic lumber. They need only that trapped moisture and a warm, sealed cavity to start devouring the structural lignin from the inside out. Silicone caulks pull the exact same trick at deck joints and window sills, trapping ambient humidity behind a flexible skin that looks perfectly intact while the wood underneath turns to powder. The chemical industry then pitches a multi-step cycle of strippers, toxic fungicides, and expensive two-part epoxies to patch the destruction their own coatings created. Yet long before acrylic polymers existed, Amish builders were keeping timber barns structural for over a century using a simple 3-ingredient oil blend that costs less than $4 to mix at home. Walk into a timber-framed barn in Lancaster County built before the Civil War, and you will notice the silence of the wood. It does not groan under the weight of 10 tons of hay because the joinery remains as tight as the day the oak pegs were driven home. These structures endure 40 inches of annual rainfall and the kind of swampy Pennsylvania humidity that should turn a standard pine beam into soft mulch in less than a decade. Yet, the hardwood in these 200-year-old structures is often so dense it will deflect a modern framing nail. The secret is not found in the species of wood alone, but in how the internal fibers are saturated. Modern hardware stores sell film-forming sealants, essentially liquid plastic that sits on top of the grain. When that plastic inevitably cracks due to UV exposure or the natural expansion of the timber, it creates a microscopic greenhouse. Water enters the crack, cannot evaporate through the plastic shell, and the fungus begins its meal in total darkness. The wood rots from the inside out, while appearing perfectly sealed to the naked eye. The Amish approach reverses this logic by using a long oil finish that never actually dries into a hard shell. It stays semi-liquid within the wood cells, moving as the wood moves and self-healing any surface abrasions. However, a 2021 study on historical preservation found a disturbing anomaly. Barns treated with this traditional oil occasionally suffered catastrophic failure in the support sills while the upper rafters remained pristine. This contradicts the idea that the oil is a universal shield. It turns out the oil's effectiveness depends entirely on its wicking direction, a mechanical property most homeowners ignore when slapping sealer on a fence. If you apply it incorrectly, you are essentially building a straw that sucks groundwater directly into the heart of your home's framing. This failure is not a flaw in the recipe, but a misunderstanding of how raw linseed oil interacts with the cellular structure of the timber. To prevent this, the Amish don't just brush it on. They wait for a specific atmospheric window where the wood's internal pressure drops. You need to understand this straw effect of the wood grain before you touch a brush, or you will spend $4 to destroy a $4,000 deck. The physics of how this oil displaces water involves a process called hydrophobic displacement, and it starts with the specific temperature of the mixture during application. Heating the oil to exactly 110 degrees Fahrenheit changes the liquid's viscosity at a molecular level, allowing it to slip into the microscopic tracheids, the tiny straws, that make up the wood's cellular structure. Most modern hardware store sealants rely on evaporation, where a solvent like mineral spirits carries a resin to the surface and then vanishes into the air. This leaves a brittle plastic film sitting on top of the wood. When that film eventually develops a hairline crack from the sun's UV rays, it begins to suck in moisture through capillary action, trapping it against the wood grain with no way to escape. You are essentially gift-wrapping your porch in a layer of rot-inducing plastic. The Amish recipe works on the opposite principle, polymerization. Raw linseed oil doesn't dry by losing volume. It grows by gaining oxygen. As the oil sits inside those wood fibers, it absorbs oxygen from the air and begins to cross-link its fatty acid chains. This transforms the liquid into a solid, flexible solid that is physically woven into the wood itself. It doesn't sit on the wood, it becomes the wood. But here is the contradiction that ruins most attempts at this. The boiled linseed oil you see on the shelf at the big box store is almost certainly the wrong tool for this job. Despite the name, that oil hasn't been boiled in decades. Instead, manufacturers add heavy metal catalysts, usually cobalt, manganese, or lead-based dryers, to force the oil to cure in 24 hours. This speed comes at a devastating cost to the wood's longevity. These metallic dryers cause the surface of the oil to skin over almost instantly. This creates a decorative shell that looks finished but leaves the oil deep inside the grain in a liquid, unpolymerized state. Over the next 3 years, that trapped liquid oil will go rancid, attracting specific types of mold that feed on the fats, effectively rotting your lumber from the inside out while the surface looks perfectly fine. To avoid this, the traditional method uses raw oil and a very specific carrier, pure gum turpentine. Unlike petroleum-based thinners, gum turpentine is distilled from pine resin. It acts as a bridge, chemically recognizing the wood fibers and pulling the raw oil deeper than any synthetic chemical can reach. You want a 50-50 mix for your first application. This ratio is thin enough to penetrate 6 millimeters deep into a standard cedar or pine board. If you apply it when the wood is cool, the oil will sit on the surface. If you apply it when it's too hot, the turpentine evaporates before it can carry the oil down. You are looking for a window where the wood is warm to the touch, but the sun isn't direct. The stakes for getting this ratio right are higher than just aesthetic. A failed polymerization doesn't just mean a sticky deck. It means you've created a fuel source for the very fungi that cause structural collapse. You are essentially feeding the rot if the oil doesn't turn into a solid polymer. This chemical transition generates its own internal heat as the molecules snap together. In a confined space, like a pile of rags soaked in this mixture, that heat can climb to over 500 degrees, leading to spontaneous combustion without a single spark. This same heat, when managed correctly on the surface of the wood, is what drives the final displacement of any remaining deep-seated moisture. But even with the perfect mix and the right temperature, there is one variable that can still turn this protective seal into a blackened, peeling mess within a single season. That variable is the sugar content in the oil itself. Most store-bought linseed oil is labeled as boiled, which sounds like a heat treatment, but is actually a chemical cocktail of metallic dryers like cobalt and manganese. These chemicals create a hard surface film that traps moisture underneath, essentially gift-wrapping your wood for the fungi to eat. To avoid the black mold bloom, you must use raw linseed oil, the unrefined fat of the flaxseed. It stays liquid longer, creeping into the cellular structure of the timber where the rot actually starts. Why would the industry push a fast-drying oil that actually destroys the wood from the inside out? The answer involves a trade-off between the manufacturers, shelf life, and the actual life of your fence, a contradiction that becomes obvious once you see the raw oil in action. You need 3 components in equal parts. Grab a clean metal bucket and pour in 1 quart of raw linseed oil. Next, add 1 quart of pure gum turpentine, not the odorless mineral spirits from the big box store. True gum turpentine is distilled from pine resin and acts as a carrier, dragging the oil deep into the grain while simultaneously killing off surface bacteria. The final ingredient is 1 quart of pine tar. This is the viscous, dark sap that smells like a campfire and provides the actual biocidal punch. It contains natural phenols that make the wood toxic to the enzymes fungi use to dissolve cellulose. This 3-quart batch costs roughly $12, bringing your cost per quart down to that $4 mark, which is a fraction of the price of a high-end synthetic sealer that only lasts 2 years. Stir this mixture with a wooden dowel for at least 5 minutes. You'll notice the pine tar resists blending at first, sitting like molasses at the bottom, but the turpentine will eventually break those long-chain hydrocarbons down into a uniform, honey-colored liquid. Here's where the math gets dangerous. You might think adding more pine tar would increase the protection, but if you exceed a 40% concentration, the mixture becomes fat, meaning it never fully polymerizes. It stays tacky for months, turning your deck into a giant sheet of flypaper for every bit of dust and pollen in the county. Worse, if you apply this to wood with a moisture content above 19%, you aren't sealing the wood, you're sealing the water inside. The sun hits the wood, the water tries to escape as vapor, and it blows the oil right out of the pores, leaving the surface looking like a shedding snake. The stakes aren't just an ugly finish. If you use the wrong ratio on a structural beam, you can actually accelerate the internal collapse while the outside looks perfectly healthy. It creates a hollow log effect where the exterior is a hardened shell, but the core has turned to mulch because the oil blocked the wood's ability to breathe out seasonal humidity. This recipe relies on a specific chemical handshake between the resin and the fiber that most modern painters have forgotten. Getting the ratio right is only half the battle, because even a perfect mix will fail if you don't account for the sun's role in the curing process. The moment you wipe that final bead of oil off your cedar post, the chemistry changes from a liquid preservative to a slow-motion fire. Raw linseed oil and tung oil do not dry by evaporation like a puddle of water or a bucket of latex paint. They cure through polymerization, a specific chemical reaction where the oil molecules cross-link with oxygen to transform into a solid, plastic-like substance. This process is exothermic. It generates heat. When the oil is spread thin across a fence board, the surrounding air wicks that heat away before you could ever feel it. But when you toss that oil-saturated cotton rag into a crumpled heap on the workshop floor, you have inadvertently built a primitive thermal reactor. The porous fibers of the cotton provide a massive surface area for oxygen to attack the oil, while the deep folds of the fabric act as high-grade insulation. Within 3 hours, the core of a bunched-up rag can hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. By hour 6, internal temperatures often climb north of 300 degrees, which is the auto-ignition point for many common textiles. You might assume that dampening the rags with a little water would solve the problem, but the physics of a trash bag tell a different story. Moisture trapped in a confined space alongside oxidizing oils can actually accelerate the thermal runaway by creating a localized greenhouse effect, preventing any chance of convective cooling. I have seen a single rag left on a wooden workbench char the timber underneath until it looked like a lightning strike, all without a spark or a match ever entering the room. National fire statistics show that spontaneous combustion from oil finishing projects accounts for roughly 1,600 home fires every year, usually starting in the middle of the night long after the homeowner thinks the job is finished. The danger is highest when you are working in humidity above 60%, as the air is heavy and stagnant, making it harder for the heat of the reaction to dissipate. To prevent your porch project from leveling your house, you need a rigid disposal protocol that handles the rags as if they were live ammunition. Never leave them in a pile, even for the length of a lunch break. If you are not ready to dispose of them permanently, lay them out flat, individually, on a non-combustible surface like a concrete driveway or a brick retaining wall. They must stay in a single layer so the heat of oxidation escapes into the atmosphere. Once they are bone dry and stiff as a sheet of cardboard, which usually takes 24 to 48 hours depending on the sun, the chemical reaction is complete and the rags are inert. If you lack the floor space, get a dedicated metal oily waste can with a self-closing lid. If you don't want to buy one, a simple gallon metal paint can filled halfway with water and a tablespoon of liquid dish soap works. Submerging the rags completely cuts off the oxygen supply, which is the only way to stop the exothermic reaction in its tracks. The danger level climbs even higher if you have thinned your Amish oil mix with mineral spirits or turpentine to help it penetrate deep into old, grayed-out lumber. These solvents have much lower flash points than the base oil, meaning they can ignite at significantly lower temperatures. As the solvent evaporates, it leaves behind a concentrated, oxygen-hungry oil residue that is primed for a spike in temperature. You are essentially handling a low-grade fuel that is actively trying to consume itself. This volatility is the trade-off for using a finish that actually enters the cellular structure of the wood rather than sitting on the surface like a cheap, peeling acrylic film. Once the rags are handled, you have to look at the wood itself, because the way the oil behaves on a horizontal deck versus a vertical fence post determines exactly how long that $4 recipe will actually last. You cannot shove a gallon of oil into a sponge that is already full of water. If you try to apply this mixture to damp timber, the oil will simply float on the surface, turn into a tacky, dust-grabbing sludge, and eventually flake away in ugly gray patches. Wood is essentially a massive bundle of microscopic straws called tracheids. When it rains, these straws swell with water. To get the oil deep into the heartwood where the rod actually starts, those straws must be empty. This is where the chemistry of the Amish method either succeeds or fails. We are relying on capillary action to pull the oil in, but water is denser and more polar than the oil components, meaning it will always win the tug-of-war for space inside those fibers. Grab a digital moisture meter from a hardware store. You are looking for a reading between 12 and 15%. Anything higher than 18% is a guaranteed failure. However, even a perfect reading can be a lie. A moisture meter only measures the electrical resistance in the top quarter inch of the wood. You might get a beautiful 12% reading on a Tuesday afternoon, but if it poured rain on Sunday, the core of that 6x6 post is still a saturated reservoir. This creates a lethal trap. If you seal the surface while the core is wet, you have built a vapor barrier. When the sun hits that wood, the internal moisture cannot escape. The temperature rises, and you have created a literal greenhouse for Gloeophyllum tribium, the fungi responsible for brown rot. You will be standing there admiring your freshly oiled deck while the joists are liquefying from the inside out. To verify the meter, use the plastic wrap test. Tape a 1-foot square of clear kitchen plastic tightly to a sunny patch of the wood, sealing all. For edges with painter's tape, leave it for 24 hours. If you see even a hint of fog or beads of condensation under that plastic the next day, the wood is still sweating. It is not ready. You need a window of at least 3 days of dry weather with humidity below 60% to ensure the deep fibers have shed their load. Once the wood is truly dry, do not oversand it. Using a fine 120 or 220 grit sandpaper polishes the wood fibers and effectively burnishes the surface, closing off the very pores we need to stay open. Stick to a rough 60 or 80 grit. You want the wood to feel slightly fuzzy to the touch, which increases the surface area and allows the oil to bite deep into the grain. If the surface feels like a piece of furniture, the oil will just sit on top and wait to be washed away by the first heavy storm. With the moisture out and the pores open, the wood is finally hungry enough to drink the first coat. You aren't just warming this up for comfort. You are physically altering the molecular weight of the mixture.